Hello, this is Jennifer Parrish, Superintendent for Poquoson City Public Schools. I would like to share with you the budget that I proposed on March 18th, 2014. First, I'd like to review the budget objectives that we used as we developed the budget this year. For those of you that have followed our budget development for the last 5 years, you will see these are the same objectives. We wanted to protect instructional programs as much as possible, ensure as few staff members as possible are unemployed as a result of budget cuts, and provide some form of additional compensation for all employees. At the end of the presentation, I will share with you which objectives we met and which ones we did not meet. This budget is based on the budget proposal that the former governor put out in December. We're using that budget because, as you probably know, the General Assembly has not completed its budget work. They are coming back into session on March 24th, and it remains to be seen when they will complete their work. I have heard from legislators that there is a possibility that the budget work by the state will not be done until sometime this summer. While we are using former Governor McDonald's introduced budget, the House did provide a budget, and in that budget it provided us with $2,500 less funding than in the other budget. The Senate budget provided us with $47,000 more than the former governor's budget. I will explain in a later slide why they provided additional funds. Again, we do not know when the state budget will be done, so we're unsure as to what kind of funding we will actually receive. And the last is the federal budget. At this point, the impact appears to be minimal. We see some increase in some title grant areas of funding and decreases in other areas. What is important to note, though, is that the federal budget is in no way assisting in making up the budget gap that the state has created for us over the last 5 years and into fiscal year 15. Just a reminder that we have made almost $5 million in budget cuts during the last 5 budget cycles. To put that in context, our budget now is about $19.8 million. So $5 million in budget cuts are clearly very deep cuts. As part of those budget cuts, we eliminated 50.5 positions. This is equivalent to 15% of our workforce. Those of you working in business and industry can only imagine what would occur if you cut 15% of your workforce. As part of our cuts, we have reduced teaching positions. Many of you know that we have been losing enrollment over the past 5 years. But it is important to note that we have cut in the last 5 years 10.5 more teaching positions than we needed to for our enrollment loss. This means to really be operating the manner that we should be, we should have those 10.5 positions back in our school division's budget. Additionally, during 3 of the past 5 budget cycles, employees have lost their jobs as a result of budget cuts. Our employee health insurance benefits were greatly reduced. We went from 4 plans to 2 plans, one of which is a high deductible plan. We also raised co-pays during the past budget cycles. We have not increased employee health insurance rates as of yet, but I will discuss that in a further slide. And finally, we did eliminate 3 instructional programs in FY12 and FY13. We eliminated 1 at the middle school and 2 at the high school. I'd like to talk about our school division and the impact state funding has had on it in the past 5 years. I will return to this topic several times during this presentation because it is very important to note and to understand. As you may know, the state cut $2.1 million in its share of the Standards of Quality funding during the last 5 years. That $2.1 million represents 20% of our current state funding. Please know that the standards of quality are those requirements that the state holds us accountable for in terms of how we staff the schools and some of the programming that we offer. They have not reduced those requirements even though they have cut our funding by $2.1 million. Those SOQ funding cuts have nothing to do with our decrease in enrollment. All the funds that we've lost because of our decrease in enrollment are on top of the funding that we've lost from the state in terms of that SOQ funding. Now, I mentioned that while the state has been cutting our funding, they haven't reduced any requirements. In fact, as they've cut our funding, they've increased the requirements and mandates that we must meet. A good example of this is the Economics and Personal Finance course that is now a graduation requirement for all of our high school students. We had to put that in place during the last few years. While the state made that a mandate, it did not provide funding for teachers to teach that course. That means our current teachers have had to teach that course and are now not teaching some of the classes that they used to teach. This has limited some of the course selection that our students at the high school have been able to make. This is certainly a valuable course, but the state really needed to provide us the funding to support the course once they made it a mandate. Another example of an unfunded mandate is the issue of CPR and first aid training. All teachers are now required to receive that training in order to be relicensed as a teacher in the state of Virginia. We have to provide that training to our teachers. We did not receive any funding to do so from the state, even though they made it a requirement. Also, that is now going to be a graduation requirement for our high school students. This means we also have to provide that instruction to our students, again, with no funding from the state for the mandate. We know that this year we can anticipate some additional new mandates coming forward. One may be that our staff will need to be trained in diabetes, again, with no support from the state financially to help us provide that training. The Virginia retirement system rates have also increased tremendously in the last few years. In the last biennium, we saw an increase that cost our school division $172,000. So in our case, we had to make budget cuts elsewhere so that we could pay for that increase in the rate. Last year at this time, some of you may remember that I indicated that we would have a problem for this year's budget already. That's because in our current budget, fiscal year 14, we have one-time state funding, totaling $75,000. The story with our locality is very different from the story with our state. They've been very supportive through the years and have made a big difference for us as we've had this budget crisis for the past 5 years. In fiscal year 10, the school division actually provided the city of Poquoson with $300,000 of one-time federal stimulus money. This was used by the city to assist them during the very early years of the recession. Since then, fiscal year 11 through fiscal year 14, our current year, the elected officials in the city of Poquoson have provided us with an additional $641,313. Imagine if they had not provided us that money, which has gone into our operating budget, we would have had to cut more than $5.6 million in the last 5 years. We have so appreciated the additional funding that they've provided and understand it is impossible for them to fill the large gap that the state elected officials have created for us. Some of these funds were used from the city, were used to support a 1% raise for Poquoson City employees in fiscal year 12. The money that was provided to the school division, an equal amount of that was used in the city to provide raises for its employees. We were able to use it also for a one-time bonus in the fall of fiscal year 12, but then had to move it into the operating budget in fiscal year 13 to save teaching positions. So during that year, our employees did not receive a raise. This past year, the General Assembly provided funding for a 2% raise. However, in providing that funding, they do not provide enough money to cover the cost of all our employees. That also includes our teachers. Their funding does not cover the cost of all of our teachers receiving raises. So we were able to use some of the funds that we got from the city of Poquoson to fill out that raise for our employees. Also, during the last few years, we have had to make a fund switch when it comes to VRS. The General Assembly passed a law that instead of school divisions across the state paying the employee's share for its employees into VRS as they had done for years, that the employees would pay that share, but they would get a raise to do so. However, in calculating the cost of making that fund switch, it costs both the school division and can cause employees to lose money as well. We've been able to use the additional money received from the city this year to ensure that at least our employees remained whole as we made that fund switch. I've mentioned enrollment decreased several times. Our enrollment has decreased by 470 students since 2006. 2006 is the year that we had the highest enrollment in our schools. From last year to this year, we lost 40 students. This budget is based on the prediction that we believe we'll lose approximately 34 students moving into next year. Please know that no matter what the budget outcome is, we will need to transfer employees between schools moving into next year. We need to make sure that we have employees in the right place in terms of our enrollment in each of the schools. Let's talk now about the projected costs and inflationary increases for fiscal year 15. As you see here, health insurance is a big cost for us, $125,000. That represents approximately a 10% increase in costs for health insurance. Please know that just over 4% of that is tied to the Affordable Care Act. We understand that next year we will face a similar percentage increase because of the Affordable Care Act. If we did not have that in place, then our health insurance costs would be somewhere over 5% rather than 10%. As I mentioned, we need to do another switch of 1% for our employees because we only have 5 years to switch the full 5%. This comes at a cost of $24,000. That will help, though, to ensure that the vast majority of our employees remain whole in terms of their paychecks. We're expecting an increase in costs in transportation and fuel, as well as utility and contracts. Clearly, this is tied to inflation. That gives us a total cost increase of $174,000 for fiscal year 15. I mentioned the Virginia retirement system earlier. As you see here, we're experiencing a rate increase of 3.04%. This means the Poquoson City Public Schools now has to provide $216,000 to VRS to cover its employees. Remember, I mentioned that last biennium the cost was $172,000, so you can see that it has increased. Please know the big reason that we're seeing such increases is because the General Assembly elected in the early years of the recession not to fully fund VRS, so we are now having to make up that difference in these years. Now, the state does provide $141,000 in its contribution for our employees into VRS, so you see the total cost of the rate increase is $357,000, with the school division paying the majority of that. What's important to note, though, is that money comes into our budget and then goes directly to VRS. You may see some graphs or hear state legislators talk about the fact that the per pupil payments from the state have increased a little bit in the last couple years. That is only because of the VRS rate increase. That rate increase puts more money into our budget, but it immediately goes out. It does not help us hire back any of the teaching positions that we've cut in the last 5 years or buy any new textbooks for our classrooms. Let's talk about the state revenue reductions. The first you see here is a local composite index increase, which for us was 0.79%. We had the highest LCI increase in all of Hampton Roads. That includes the Peninsula, South Side, and the Eastern Shore. The local composite index is based on the citizens' income, as well as sales tax revenues, as well as real estate property value. The formula also takes into consideration the population of the locality, and finally, the average daily membership of the schools. Because our LCI has increased by 0.79%, it means that the formula says that our locality can afford to pay more for our schools, which means the state will pay less. In our case, the state is paying $93,000 less. So again, that's a big revenue reduction for us. And I want to remind you once again, we had the largest LCI increase in all of the Hampton Roads areas. In fact, only one other school division received an increase at all on the peninsula, but that was a 0.004 increase. All other school divisions on the peninsula actually saw their LCI decrease, which means they're getting more money from the state. Again, the enrollment loss that I mentioned does come at a cost for us of $110,000. Also, I mentioned that we have one-time state funding in our budget this year that is eliminated for next year. That comes at a cost of $75,000. So our total state revenue reduction is $278,000. Next, I'd like to talk about state rebenchmarking. Virginia rebenchmarks each biennium, and what this means is they're determining how much the state should pay for education. The problem, though, for the rebenchmarking that they did for this biennium is the fact that they've based it on a budget in which they've already cut $1.2 billion from K-12 education. We do not believe that what the state is actually paying for education now reflects the cost of education. As I've mentioned earlier, we've made deep cuts as a result of the state cuts. Yet because they rebenchmarked on the $1.2 billion deficit budget, it means that school divisions across the state are getting far less money in the rebenchmarking that they should moving into this biennium budget. As you see here, we will receive $102,000 for special education funding as part of the rebenchmarking, But you need to know that $102,000 correlates directly with an increase in special education services that we're applying or we're providing for our students. Some of those services occur within our schools, and some of those services are for students who receive an education in out-of-district placements. So that $102,000 doesn't enable us to hire teachers for the positions that we've cut in the last 5 years, or to purchase any instructional materials for our classrooms. The rebenchmarking does provide us with an additional $116,000, but you need to remember that I said earlier we were dealing with a $75,000 one-time funding in our budget this year. So in reality, we get $116,000, which fills the $75,000 gap, and it means we only have $41,000 more dollars from the state than we had in the last biennium in terms of the rebenchmarking. While $41,000 is helpful, it certainly does not begin to touch the $2.1 million in SOQ funding that was cut over the last 5 years as a result of the work in Richmond. So you can see here what our total budget impact is for fiscal year 15. Our cost increases total $174,000. The VRS rate increase costs us $216,000. We see the state revenue reduction of $278,000. We do see revenue coming in due to rebenchmarking of $218,000, but please remember that $102,000 of that is going directly into services for special education students. $75,000 of that just replaces the hole that we would have in our budget next year for the one-time payment, with only truly $41,000 additional dollars to use to try and fill the gap that was created over the last 5 years. So our total budget shortfall is $450,000. Here are some potential budget actions, and I use the word potential because you'll see in the coming slides that I have some hope that we may not have to make these actions. First of all, categorical cuts. We've done here is cut 5% of our spending for materials, equipment, and professional development. That comes at a total of $12,700. Those of you who have followed our budget in the last 5 years will definitely remember that usually under the categorical cuts category, we have multiple bulleted items that come up to a fairly large total. In fact, last year when we did our budget cuts, we were able to make over $111,000 in categorical cuts. We simply cannot do that anymore. We have to keep heating and air conditioning running in our buildings. We have to keep our buses running. We need to be able to provide supplies to our teachers and to our students. We just cannot cut in any more of those areas after making so many deep cuts in the last 5 years. That's why the categorical cuts are so minimal this year. I can say that we are working with city staff to determine if we can find any additional cost savings in terms of our shared service of ground maintenance. We've been sharing that service for a number of years now, and the contract is up, so we're looking to determine if there are ways to save as we move forward with that area. We are also now looking to see if we can have a shared service in the area of maintenance that could save both us and potentially the city budget as well. Note that we currently have multiple shared services with the locality, both in fleet maintenance and IT as well as grounds maintenance. So we've looked everywhere to provide a savings for both us and the city budget. Here you can see is where the bulk of the shortfall would be filled, and that's through personnel cuts. You can see here that we're proposing cutting 4.5 teaching positions that totals over $258,000 in budget cuts. At this point, I cannot provide concrete information as to where those positions would be cut. Ultimately, that will depend on how students are scheduled into classes, as well as what happens in terms of staffing changes in the coming months. We do anticipate some additional attrition. No matter what, if we make those cuts, we will be reducing instructional program availability. It may mean fewer classes are offered in the secondary level, and less time in some programs are provided to students at the elementary level. What you see here is we're also proposing as part of these potential budget actions cutting 5 support positions. Those will come in the area of maintenance, transportation, and paraeducators. As you know, the paraeducators work in our classrooms to directly support our teachers. That would provide us over $168,000 in savings. And finally, I mentioned employee health insurance earlier in this presentation. We're proposing that if we have to take these budget actions, that we will increase employee health insurance rates for employees who are enrolled in our health plan as employee only. So these are not employees who are enrolled in our health plan with children or with spouses. The rate increase would be $10 a month, which would provide us another $10,900 in savings. It does mean that our employees who fall in that category would have less take-home pay during the course of next year. In personnel cuts, our total budget actions would give us $437,300. What you see here is between the categorical cuts and the personnel cuts, we would be able to fill our budget shortfall of $450,000. I do want to speak for a second about the personnel cuts. You may remember that earlier in the presentation I mentioned that in the last 5 years we've cut 15% of our workforce. If we are to make the cuts that are proposed in this budget, we will now be cutting 18% of our workforce. Keep in mind we've seen an enrollment decrease, but it's only been an enrollment decrease of 7%. So with an enrollment decrease of 7% and a cut in the workforce of potentially 18%, you can see we've cut far deeper into our workforce than we needed to compared to our enrollment decrease. And that has caused people to pick up additional duties, and also, as you know, has affected our instructional program. Please know, though, out of the 18%, only 34% of those were teaching positions. We've done our best in the past 5 years to protect the classroom as much as possible, but now need to move these personnel cuts more into the classroom area. Again, I just want to remind you the situation that we have with the state and with elected officials in the state in terms of their support, or rather lack of support, for funding of public education. Again, during the last 5 years, our education budget for K-12 has been reduced by $1.2 billion. This includes the cuts to SOQ funding that I mentioned earlier, which for us was $2.1 million. Also, reductions in construction funding for schools. They also capped the support staff with an arbitrary cap, so they are no longer paying as much money for our support staff. That includes school psychologists, paraeducators, bus drivers, people that we need to support our children to ensure we can provide an appropriate program for them. I also mentioned the fact that we've got new requirements while they've cut our requirements. But I want to mention to you that in fact they've never fully funded the SOQ requirements. So while they keep increasing them, they keep reducing our money, in the first place, they never actually funded it all the way. A great example of this is they still don't fully fund for a full-time elementary principal, despite the fact that that's a requirement for us and certainly something that we need in our elementary and primary schools. Also, during the course of the last 5 years, the state per pupil funding has dropped by as much as $760 per pupil. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a slight uptick in the past 2 years, but that's only because of the VRS rate increase, which again does not touch our students, doesn't help fill in the gap that was created over the last 5 years, so we're unable to hire back teaching positions or other staff members. I think I mentioned earlier as well that the former governor's introduced budget doesn't take into account any inflationary costs. Yet, when the budget was drafted, they took into account inflationary costs for state employees. What they did with the state employees is in factoring the increased cost of health insurance, they factored in inflationary costs, but they didn't do that for school divisions in the state. Please keep in mind that the Virginia Constitution requires that the state of Virginia provide a public education system to its citizens. I'm not sure why state employees were treated differently than school division employees when it's a constitutional requirement to fund your schools. And those of you that read ahead can see the last bullet here. Virginia's spending ranks 13th in the nation for its spending on prisoners, and it ranks 38th in the nation for its spending on children in K-12 education. The message I get here is our prisoners are of a higher priority than our kindergarten students are. And perhaps if more funding were put into K-12 education, there wouldn't be as great of a need to fund for prisoners in our Commonwealth. Again, I find this statistic appalling. Throughout numerous conversations with our city manager and with city council members, and also in conversations between the city manager and the city council, They have indicated that they wish to place our school division as one of two priorities for funding as they prepare their budget for fiscal year 15. The other priority being that they need to fulfill the required payments for the debt service that they currently have in our city. This increase in debt service is a result of the new fire station and elementary school station that were built a number of years ago. As you see below here in the note, for fiscal year 15, the city will need to find $604,000 for its operating budget for debt service, and then the following year, in fiscal year 16, they'll see an increased cost of $280,000 for a total of $884,000. What we are requesting as part of this budget is that the locality fill the entire shortfall for us. So we are requesting local funds of $450,000 additional dollars. Our city has been, as I've mentioned earlier, incredibly supported during the last 5 years. We are once again asking them to try and partially fill the gap that the state has created as it's cut educational funding and shifted its priority for education in the state. I mentioned earlier I would come back to the budget development objectives. As you see here, the first one was to protect instructional program as much as possible. As is the case on this page, the first bullet indicates what will happen if we are able to receive the $450,000 from local funding so that we do not have a budget shortfall this year. All instructional programs will be maintained as they currently are. However, if we do not receive that funding, or we only receive part of that funding, we'll see a reduction of availability of instructional programs and classes. This means we may not offer classes as often as we do in the secondary level, and children may not have as much experience in certain programs at the elementary level. In terms of the second objective, ensuring as few staff members as possible are unemployed as a result of budget cuts, you'll see that if we do receive the $450,000, that no layoffs will occur. However, if we do not receive the full $450,000, layoffs may occur as we move into fiscal year 15. We simply do not have the attrition that we would need to make those personnel cuts. And finally, the third bullet provides some form of additional compensation for all employees. What you see here is unfortunate in that we cannot provide additional compensation, but if we do receive the full $450,000, it will remain level funded. If we do not, some employees will actually experience a decrease in take-home pay as a result of the increased health insurance rates. Again, there are localities in our area that are able to pay additional compensation to their employees. That's for teachers and all other school division employees. But they are in a different situation. Their local composite index decreased rather than increased. They also have increased enrollment, and their budgets are just in an entirely different form at this time. Here is the budget process as we move forward. There'll be a public hearing on the budget I've outlined this evening on March 27th. The school board will either approve the budget on March 27th or may ask for some additional changes, in which case they would approve that budget on March 31st. The budget is then forwarded to City Council for their review on April 1st. City Council will work on the budget then in April and May. If the budget is not fully funded by City Council, then we will go back to the budget and make the necessary changes to it. Underlying all of this is the fact that the General Assembly still needs to complete its budget. As I mentioned, we've heard it could take as late as into the summer, which will be quite problematic for us, as it will be for school divisions across the state, because we will not even be able to issue contracts to our employees until the General Assembly completes its work. Just in summary, a reminder that we've made over $5 million in cuts in the last 5 years, which included 50.5 positions over the past 5 years. We would be adding to that another 9.5 positions, which would take us to 60 positions if we do have to make additional reductions to our budget. Again, that would mean we'd be cutting 18% of our workforce. Any reductions that we have will impact instruction and our support systems. You simply cannot continue to provide the same instructional program after having made almost $5 million in cuts over the last 5 years and looking at a potential shortfall of another $450,000. We will continue to face new mandates both by the federal and state governments. Those mandates will be in the area of student achievement, but also, as I mentioned earlier, training areas such as training our teachers to better understand the needs of diabetic students. What we do continue to face is an unwillingness for our state elected officials to restore funding to K-12 education, despite the fact that they do continue to increase mandates for us. And finally, we do predict that we'll see an enrollment loss for fiscal year 16. That would be the year after next. We are watching and tracking our enrollment very carefully because it may affect other decisions that we make in the coming years. I thank you for taking the time to watch and listen to this presentation. Please call me or email me if you have any additional questions or suggestions. Again, please know that we continue to do the best we can to provide a wonderful instructional program for the children of Poquoson. Our employees have worked diligently in the last 5 years, despite the major cuts that we've made, to do all that they can for our students. Thank you.